In the heart of Bavaria, on top of a cliff, there's a castle. This is Neuschwanstein. It's the brainchild of King Ludwig II. It's a monument to medieval fantasy in a modern age. But it's more than just stones and spires. It's the embodiment of a dream. A vision so vast, it teeters on the brink of the impossible. See, King Ludwig II was the King of Bavaria from 1864 until his death in 1886. He dreamt of a perfect world, an escape, a creation that would immortalise his ideals. Of course, Ludwig's obsession drained treasuries, drew criticism, and yet he built, undeterred, a castle that would never be completed. It was a dream that would outlive the dreamer.
Alright, quiet on the set.
Camera speed.
Sound production, take one.
A century later, and over an entire ocean, there was another visionary who was about to embark on his own quest. He is the favourite director of the most pretentious film student that you know, and his project, an epic about the life of Napoleon Bonaparte. Like Ludwig, Kubrick was a man obsessed with a vision. And Kubrick's is a name synonymous with cinematic genius. Best known for his groundbreaking movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey, A Clockwork Orange, or that time he faked the moon landing. But Napoleon was to be his magnum opus, a culmination of meticulous research, unparalleled scale, and artistic perfection. So what happened? This is a tale of obsession.
He describes these battle scenes as ballets, as violent ballets.
A tale of studio politics.
Yeah, he probably was relieved because she would have been half the budget.
A tale that includes government contracts for a different nation's army.
We have received bids from Romania to provide up to a maximum of 30,000 troops.
Specially designed lenses, originally designed for use in outer space.
This lens is not, no way you can put it on a movie camera. I told Stanley this, and Stanley was not a man who takes no for an answer.
An assault mine in Hutchinson, Kansas. This is the story of Stanley Kubrick's Napoleon.
So Kubrick, the artiste, the filmmaker, the visionary, if you will. I'm a fan. I'm a big fan of
This is my co-host, Eden Porter. He's an actor and a comedian. Oh, and he was also on Survivor once.
We've heard all the things about a million takes and doing things again and again. So there's obviously a bit of obsessive compulsive there, but I think that's how you get the best out of your actors, Cambo.
Just to slowly torture them.
Yeah, I just think you just slowly torture them and drive them freaking fully insane. But yeah, I'm a fan. I am a fan.
Throughout these episodes, I'm going to take Eden on a journey through Stanley Kubrick's mind and what went into him trying to adapt the life of Napoleon to film. Before we get into the film, here's a couple of little disclaimers I want you to know. Firstly, we're breaking with the tradition and the format that this show normally sticks to, and this film will be covered over 3 episodes. This first episode, the one you're listening to right now, this will cover all the pre-production of the film, the history of the project, and who was getting involved. Part 2 next week will strictly be about the screenplay, the story of the film. And then finally, in the 3rd week, we'll hear about how it all fell apart and an interesting story from a special guest about how the screenplay was rediscovered later on. Also, a lot of the research and documentation you're going to hear throughout these episodes is taken from a Tasshan publication called Stanley Kubrick's Napoleon, the Greatest Movie Never Made, that was compiled by Alison Castle. We'll also be hearing some excerpts from the documentary Lost Kubrick. Throughout these episodes, you'll hear some archival interview audio from Jan Harlan, Kubrick's producer and brother-in-law, Anthony Fruin, an assistant of Stanley, John Baxter, Paul Duncan, and Stuart McDougall, all of which have written biographies on Kubrick, and John Calley, a former Warner Brothers executive. It really begins in the 60s.
Would you call it the swinging 60s?
It's actually the late 60s, so I think the swinging was almost over.
Yeah, okay, so this is
Swinging has stopped. I think the Vietnam War has started.
This is the shaken 60s.
Yeah.
It's not so much swinging, yeah.
Well, it's specifically 1968. Kubrick is completing 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it releases to huge fanfare and critical acclaim, and importantly, box office receipts. This was produced and released by MGM Studios. And MGM Studios are a very important part of this story.
Oh.
Because they were Kubrick's collaborators. And when you have a 2001 style hit, that's when you get to make whatever you want to make next.
Yeah, this is when passion projects come into play, Campbell.
Oh, big time. And there was one passion project Kubrick always had.
What he really wanted to make was a film about Napoleon, because Napoleon was someone he revered.
Napoleon was one of the abiding interests of Stanley's life, along with extraterrestrial intelligence, the Holocaust, concentration camps, Julius Caesar, English place name etymology, and 3,000 other things. Stanley had a tough time keeping up with his interests. You know, it was a full-time job being Stanley.
At earliest opportunity, once he's had his big, huge commercial breakthrough critical acclaim hit, he says, well, I want to make Napoleon now. And that's what he starts working on. He did extensive reading, and he actually slowly created a makeshift library of pretty much every single book he could find on Napoleon at the time. And it included over 500 volumes of literature on the subject.
Oh, are you kidding me?
Be it about Napoleon or the era, the locations that he was in. He had a library of over 500 books on the subject of Napoleon.
Cambo, are you familiar with dramaturgy? So dramaturgy is like dramaturgical work. It's like when you do a theatre play, you do research on it and you go down, you sit through and you've researched stuff. Most people put together like a binder or something, and it's got all the little things. You're telling me he created a library.
That's right. Now, while we may not have created an entire library like Stanley did, we did do our research and we did consult a book that I mentioned earlier on. I hold in my hands a book. Well, more of a tome than a book. Stanley Kubrick's Napoleon, the greatest movie never made. A definitive collection of all of the research, paperwork, photographs, and even scripts that Stanley Kubrick had collated to make this film. It was compiled by Alison Castle, so I had to sit down with her and find out all about it. You have a very special part of my life that you've now contributed to, which is you have produced the biggest book that I own, which is your Stanley Kubrick Napoleon book. It is an absolute behemoth of a book.
Well, I noticed that what you have is the smaller version of the book. The original was a limited edition that was really huge, and it was cut. The pages were cut out, and all the different chapters were in separate books, tucked inside like a real art object.
I'm interested, how did you get involved with the archiving of Kubrick's works and especially all of his documentation on Napoleon?
So I was just very lucky. I was a huge disciple, I guess, of Stanley Kubrick, or just a fan. And I just adored his work. And I started working with Tosh, and I did a book for them on Some Like It Hot. And I was doing writing for the publisher. And the publisher seemed to think, why not give this young person a shot? I must have been not even 30 years old when he said, why don't you, the Kubricks have gotten in touch with me. It was a couple of years after Kubrick had died. And they said, the Kubricks have gotten in touch. They wanted to know if we wanted to do a book about Napoleon. And the publisher said to me, I don't know if I'm interested in Napoleon, but I might be interested in a book about Kubrick. So why don't you go over there and just do a little recon and see what's up? So I was like, I couldn't have had a more exciting mission, possibly. Of course, I lived in Paris, which was very convenient. I lived there for many years, so I could just take the Eurostar and then hop on a commuter train and go to St. Albans, which is the closest train station to Chillickberry, which is the house where Kubrick lived for the last 20-odd years of his life with his wife, Christiana, and his 3 daughters. Well, they were probably young adults. By the time I got there, though, they were living elsewhere. And I was so delighted. And of course, then they said, well, let's go look at the archives. And the archives were spread in boxes just all over the estate. It was a large house with stables and outbuildings and all these sorts of things. And there was just everything in the basement, and all the outbuildings was crammed full of boxes from his whole career. It was like being an archaeologist at the most exciting site you could find. Open a box and find like the Star Child from 2001. I literally found the Star Child. I found the bloody severed head of the sniper from the end of Full Metal Jacket. That was a really scary box to open. It was like shocking.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's like a scene out of Seven.
So that's a very long-winded way of answering your question of how I came to Napoleon, because after that was published, the Kubricks still wanted to do Napoleon, and the Kubrick Archives book was successful, and they said, let's do it.
What a fascinating project to be able to go through all the boxes, all the archives. I'm sure you saw the infamous library with all the Napoleon books in it as well at the house.
Well, it wasn't a library as much as it was actually the Steenbeck room. It was a room off of the Steenbeck room, which was off of his projection room. His projection room was still intact, and that actually got converted. During the years I was working there, they eventually took apart the production room, which wasn't being used, and made it into a beautiful library for the house. But off of that room, there was a Steenbeck, Stanley's old Steenbeck, which is a 35 millimeter editing deck, by the way, for people who don't know, where you could put the reels of film on and look at them and watch them. I used that to select the frames for the part of the book that's just film frames. And then in a room off of that was shelves and shelves and shelves and shelves of Napoleon books. So it's probably a little bit of an overstatement to call it a library, but that you have to consider that this was 30 years after the project had initially failed, and he was still, up till the end of his life, thinking he would love to do it.
He also started a collaboration with an Oxford professor called Felix Markham. And Felix Markham was a Napoleon expert, and he had written Kubrick's favorite book on Napoleon. So he actually hired Markham to help him with all of the academic study for the movie. So this is when Kubrick started collecting images. And there were images of anything related to the Napoleonic era. It was castles, it was palaces, it was costumes, it was paintings from that era. And he amassed them on little slides that you could project. Now, if you're a man obsessed, how many images do you think you would need to get an idea of the era?
A normal man would have, 100 images or something like that. That would give you a good rounding up of these images that you could use and give and take.
If you're really obsessed, maybe 500, 1,000.
Maybe, yeah. Look, if you're really obsessed,
yeah,
like you have 500. That's when you go, look, that's a lot of images.
Yeah.
Cambo, hit me with the number. Hit me the number, buddy.
17,000.
That's insane.
He amassed 17,000 slides of Napoleonic imagery, which included paintings, drawings, etchings, engravings, sculptures from the period, and anything that he thought could give him a sense of the time, of the period that it was.
That's more images than I've done, like essays of like 17,000 word essays. Like I've done shorter. Like that's insane. That's a lot.
Keeping tally now, we now have 500 books and 17,000 images.
17,000 images. I'm just imagining him sitting down, Kubrick, with one of those like the little viewfinder things. When you
like
click, you click through. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
He's just there going like 1,
good,
2, 3, 4. Gets up to 17,000.
Old Felix in the corner just waiting patiently for Kubrick to finish with his little magic viewfinder.
16,999. Yeah, good.
So another thing that they did is location scouting. So Kubrick he eventually hired a team of research assistants to help him. And Kubrick sent research assistants, including his own brother-in-law, which is film producer Jan Harlan, And Jan Harlan produced quite a few Kubrick movies and became a very close friend of his. He sent him all across Europe to scout thousands of different locations. Now, they had to take a couple of location scouting photographs. If you were doing this for a project, Eden, how many location scouting photographs do you think you'd take?
Well, I think a normal person.
Let's start with normal person.
Normal people, you'd probably want. Let's go. If you're really detailed, there's a lot of locations in a film. Maybe 1,000.
1,000, yeah. Then if you're obsessed, maybe 5,000.
Maybe 5,000 if you're obsessed.
Yeah.
Hit me with another number.
15,000.
That's too many images to look at. You can't look at that many images, Kembo.
Well, he took 15,000 scouting photographs, or not him, but his team, ensuring that the film settings would be as historically and geographically accurate as possible. Now, geographically is an interesting one, because do you know what Kubrick did to make sure that everything was authentic?
I'm assuming this is something to do with the soil.
So obsessive was Kubrick that Andrew brought back a sample of the earth of Waterloo so that wherever they recreated the battle, they could do it with exactly the same colour earth.
You know what, Cambo? I've seen a lot of films, as have you. Mm-hmm. I enjoy film. I've worked in the film industry. I've been in some films. I've watched films my whole life, and I have never, ever watched a film and gone, geez, that soil doesn't look quite right, does it? For this geographical period. Like, that's not something I take into account.
Like, you see the obsession, right? Like, this is absolutely insane. This brings us to one of the things that I would say is arguably best known about this project, which is Kubrick's index card.
Now, there's research and there's research. Now, Kubrick got it to a point where he had a filing cabinet full of cards, and on these cards were every day of Napoleon's life. He could pick a card and he would be able to tell you where Napoleon was, what he was doing, why he was doing it. That's the level of research, detailed research that he did on Napoleon.
No. That's amazing.
So this brings me to something I want to make sure that we're keeping check of, because the thing this is always going to be compared to now is Ridley Scott's Napoleon movie.
Well, yes, exactly. Yeah, and we can do that now because we've got the comparison. Yeah,
exactly. And I'm sure was getting sick of people asking him questions about Kubrick's Napoleon during that press tour. Yeah. But this was going to be a big scale Napoleon movie. Ridley Scott's is the first one in years and years and years and years to have tackled it. Yeah. So I wanted to I've painted a picture now, I believe, of Kubrick's obsession, 500 books, 17,000 images, 15,000 location photos, all to make sure he could accurately track with 100% precision every single day of the life of Napoleon Bonaparte with 100% accuracy. I want you to read a quote from Ridley Scott around what he thinks of historical accuracy in movies.
Okay, this will be good. This will be really good. When I have issues with historians, I ask, excuse me, mate, where were you? Were you there? No. Well, shut the fuck up.
Now, Ridley Scott's movie has been accused of being historically inaccurate. And Ridley Scott doesn't care.
No, he says, were you there? No. Well, shut the fuck up.
With all the research done, Stanley could start pre-production. Here are some notes written by Stanley Kubrick all about that process.
Production notes for Napoleon, November 22nd, 1968. Length, 180 minutes. Shoot, 1.3 minutes average per day. Length schedule, 150 days, allowing 10 days lost to travel. Start date, July 1 through September 1, 1969.
He had everything blocked out to be filmed in sections to try and maximize the time they had with the budget they were given.
Days, 30 for battles and marches, for location exteriors, 40 for location interiors, 30 for front projection, 10 lost to travel, 150 total. Treatment, 15 sequences, which will approximately average 12 minutes per sequence, giving 180 minutes finished length.
He wanted to shoot everything as naturally as possible.
What do you mean naturally?
He didn't want to have too much Hollywood lighting because the big concern about this movie was the budget. Movies like this are always going to cost a lot. And he had realized that if you shot in a lot of palaces in France, they're already kind of set decked. So you didn't have to build the set.
Building and decorating a large number of palatial sets for emperors and kings would be a formidable expense indeed, somewhere I should say between $3 and $6 million. A number of authentic palaces and villas of the period are available for shooting in France and Italy. These locations can be rented for a daily fee of between $350 and $750, and in most cases are completely furnished, requiring only the most minor work on our part before shooting.
Jan Harlan, his producer and brother-in-law, went to NASA and got a camera lens that's developed for photography in outer space.
Cambo, have you just accidentally confirmed that Kubrick filmed the moon landing?
We don't know how he had the contacts at NASA. That's all we're saying.
I'm just saying it's very interesting.
But the reason he did this is those lenses, huge lenses,
I can assume they absorb more
light.
Yeah.
So you could shoot with a really low f-stop.
Yeah.
And you could light a scene by candlelight if you wanted to. This is a technique that Kubrick and Jan Harlan actually ended up using in the movie Barry Lyndon, a movie that I will confess to you now, dear listener, it is my great shame to admit I've never seen. It's a Kubrick film that has escaped me my whole life, and it's an embarrassing thing that risks my cinephile card being taken away from me. But here is Jan Harlan talking about those lenses that were eventually used in Barry Lyndon.
Stanley discovered in the American Cinematographer, a magazine, that there is a lens with a 50mm 07. I said, I don't believe it. I never heard of this. And I finally spoke to a Dr. Camera. And Dr. Camera said, oh no, well, it's terribly sorry, but because it has no way you can put it on a movie camera. I told Stanley this. And Stanley was not a man who takes no for an answer. And he finally reached a Di Giulio, a very, very fine camera technician and bastler. So I bought one and I took it to Los Angeles. And Di Giulio admired it, said, wonderful, fantastic piece of glass, but there is no camera.
I said, Stanley, it's absolutely impossible because the BNC has 2 shutters, a thick aperture plate, and all that between the film plane and the rear element of the lens. And so I explained that to Stanley and said we would have to damn near wreck your camera and make it purely dedicated to do this. And he said, fine, go ahead and do it.
The next obstacle to tackle was the battles, something that cost a lot of money, take a lot of time, which is a thing that studios are notoriously chill about. Here's Kubrick's plan.
His plans for those battle scenes are super interesting. He really wanted them to be very realistic. He wanted there to be as many people and as many horses and swords and everything that you would have had in the real battle.
Well, he had designed it so that it was reasonably inexpensive, considering the fact that it was Napoleon and had vast battle scenes.
So he actually had agreements with the armies of Yugoslavia and Romania and priced out what they would charge per soldier per day.
Here are Stanley Kubrick's notes about this.
The daily cost of a costume extra in England is $19.20, $14.28 in Italy, $24, France, $24.30. We have received bids from Romania to provide up to a maximum of 30,000 troops at $2 per man, though it is unlikely that we will ever exceed 15,000 men on the largest days.
So Kubrick had the problem of his army sorted. Well, sort of. He still had to dress them.
On any large historical subject with military uniforms, the cost of the military uniforms normally represents an extremely large portion of the budget.
And Kubrick found this brand new kind of fabric that now we know as Tyvek.
I believe we have made quite a big breakthrough in this area by finding a company in New York who make printed clothing, in this case military uniforms, on a special DuPont paper, which is fireproof and has a 300-pound breaking strength.
So you would have like 4,000 people in proper costumes, the people you would be able to see. But in the background, you would have 10, 20, 100,000 people in paper costumes.
So for people that were very far away, they could just print what looked like a uniform and boots on a Tyvek bodysuit. Like what we with hazmat suits now, they could have just worn those in the distance and it would look like they had boots and full uniforms on. And that would have cut down the budget enormously.
If we want to bring the story of Stanley Kubrick's Napoleon to life, and we do, we need to talk a little bit about Napoleon. And more specifically, who was going to play him.
Napoleon was 27 when he took command of the army of Italy, and 30 when he became first consul. He was 35 when he was proclaimed emperor, 45 at Waterloo, and 51 when he died. I want an actor of between 30 and 35 who has the good looks of a younger Napoleon and who can be aged and made up for the middle-aged Napoleon.
Yeah, so for the Napoleon, he had three people in mind at various times. It was David Hemming, who's really famous for Antonioni's blow-up. Bit too handsome from my point of view, actually. He was looking at him. And Ian Holm, who actually did play Napoleon in a Terry Gilliam film later on.
But there was someone that Kubrick saw in the movie Easy Rider, and that was Jack Nicholson.
Jack Nicholson. That's who I know. I've heard.
Yeah.
I've heard that
Yeah.
Jack was being looked at for Napoleon.
Here's Jack Nicholson talking about Kubrick testing out to see whether he might be right for the role.
He called me like he does many people out of nowhere. I didn't believe it was him on the phone. And as he is to almost all other people, very flattering and very nice about your work. And, still being Stanley, he wanted to make sure I could speak other than as a Southerner. He had seen Easy Rider, so he had me read something from a play and put it on tape, make sure I spoke regular English,
Look, I know this is more of a Kubrick had written a name down kind of a thing, and maybe. But I love this casting choice so much.
Dude, we love Jack Nicholson here at Cancer Movie Report.
And 1970s Jack Nicholson as Napoleon in a Kubrick film, it's clearly the choice for our scene recreations we had to go with.
Oh, you have to. So this is before, when was The Shining? The Shining was 80?
80.
80? Yeah, it was 80.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
this is before The Shining, yeah.
Yeah, this is before all that, yeah.
What I like to think is in a historical movie like this, especially one that Hollywood makes, if people are foreign, like French, that means they're English. Ancient Rome, they're English.
They're English. They're all English, Cambo.
So I like to think that this cast would have been full of Brits, and then Jack Nicholson would just not have done an accent. He would have sounded like Jack Nicholson surrounded by posh British actors.
This is Hunt for Red October style. Like Sean Connery just go, you know what? I'm Russian, but I'm not going to speak like that.
And do you know what confirmed this to me a little bit?
What?
Ridley Scott's Napoleon. Where everyone is British.
Yeah, that's true.
And then Joaquin Phoenix is just American.
Yeah, that's so true.
The main crux, what interested Kubrick in this story was Napoleon and Josephine. And he was obsessed with this idea that this brilliant man was essentially undone by love because he was so obsessed with Josephine that he never thought straight about her. And eventually kind of it undid him. Like he's like, it's the most genius man in history that was just undone because of love and because of obsession.
That's a great story plot device, Cambo.
Yeah. And you can see that's a very Kubrick thing. Like, the hubris of a man. The folly of a man is his love.
Yeah.
So there's only one confirmed person that was sent an offer.
Mm.
Do you know who this is?
I did not. I just only knew about Jack.
He sent a letter offering the role to Audrey Hepburn.
Oh, Audrey.
So Kubrick wanted Audrey Hepburn to play Josephine, and he wrote her a letter asking whether she would consider. And she had just had a child at this time, and the only documentation that we actually know is she sent him a letter back that said this.
Sunday, 17 November 68. Dear Mr. Kubrick, thank you for the kind letter you wrote me. I am flattered and happy you would like me to work with you. I still don't want to work for a while, so cannot commit or involve myself in any project at this time. I hope you understand this and will think of me again someday. Thank you again. Warmest wishes, Audrey Hepburn.
It sounded like a polite way of saying thanks. Yeah, he probably was relieved because she would have been half the budget or something.
But in order to fully bring Kubrick's vision to life, we love the idea of Audrey. So we've used the sound alike in these scenes. We need to return to our friend Ridley Scott.
Okay.
Ridley Scott cast Vanessa Kirby as Josephine, who is 13 years younger than Joaquin Phoenix, playing a character that's supposed to be 6 years older than Joaquin Phoenix.
Yeah.
And when asked about casting her so young, what did Ridley Scott say?
On Vanessa Kirby being over 15 years too young? I don't think it matters.
So after years of research, on September 29th, 1969, Stanley Kubrick had a draft of the script. So, do you want to see what 500 books, 17,000 images, 15,000 location photos, an index card for every day of Napoleon's life, a NASA lens designed for outer space, Jack Nicholson, Audrey Hepburn, what it resulted in when you get to the screenplay that came together for Stanley Kubrick's Napoleon?
Big time, Cambo.
Well, here we are. We've come to the end of part one of our report on Stanley Kubrick's Unmade Napoleon. Make sure you join us next week because we are just getting started. Next episode, we'll be breaking down the screenplay to Stanley Kubrick's Napoleon.
Oh, shut up, will you? Your tears have absolutely no effect on me. I am not a man like any other man.
We'll also be hearing about the letters of correspondence he was setting during the screenwriting process to make sure that every event that he was writing about lined up with what was actually true.
Dear Felix, how would a king address a lesser noble in conversation?
And we hear about some unusual screenplay conventions that were used in the film.
And the script has a lot of things about it that don't seem particularly Kubrickian, and they don't strike me as things that made a lot of sense for him, but they really would have made a lot of sense to the executives.
But it doesn't end there, because in part 3, we also hear from a special guest about how a lot of this was rediscovered in the 1990s. It's a story you may have never heard before. A huge thank you to Alison Castle for sitting down and talking to us about all the research she did to pull together Stanley Kubrick's Napoleon, the greatest movie never made. And again, we also pulled some interview clips from the documentary Lost Kubrick. Eshaana Sheth was the voice of Audrey Hepburn, and Michael Hahn was the voice of Stanley Kubrick. Thank you to my co-host Eden Porter. My name is Michael Campbell, and I have hosted and edited this episode. And this show is completely funded by the amazing people that support us over on Patreon. But until then, take care.